Well, it's Transfiguration Sunday. And I sort of went the direction that Michelle did with the children, but a little bit different. Because my point of view is this. All of us have faced something that we would rather avoid. I'm sure that's true. Maybe it was a medical procedure, like the dreaded colonoscopy, or surgery. Maybe it was having to give someone some difficult news. Maybe we faced having to be in the midst of an emotional situation. Or maybe we had to make a decision, and there were no good choices. No doubt, all of us have been in a situation like that. When I thought of those 4 examples I just gave, I realized I could give a couple personal descriptions for each one. But I decided you probably didn't want to have to listen to that much stress and sadness. So I continued to reflect on that, and I thought, all of those kinds of situations tend to be ones that are out of our control, over which we feel powerless. And that was true in today's gospel lesson of Peter and James and John, at the moment that we call the transfiguration. Just to give us a little bit of perspective, let's remember that this event, called the Transfiguration, is we might call it a pivotal moment in the life of Jesus. It's a bridge between one part of his life, one phase of his life, and another. And in the church year, it's the bridge between the season of Epiphany and the season of Lent, which is why every year we read the story of the Transfiguration. It occurs on a mountaintop, which in the Gospel of Matthew is somewhat significant. You'll remember that for the last 4 weeks, we have been focusing on the words of Jesus called the Sermon on the Mount. So at the beginning of his ministry, Jesus is on a mountain with his followers, and he's telling them what being a disciple will entail. And we discovered during the last 4 weeks that it's not easy. That sometimes Jesus requires a great deal of us, and that in the eyes of the world, what Jesus asks us to do is sometimes foolish. Very good. But the greatest foolishness is yet to come. So Jesus is up on the mountaintop again at the end of his ministry, and the foolishness of the cross is on the horizon. So Peter, James, and John are there with Jesus. And they're feeling confused. They're feeling powerless. How do I know that? It didn't say that in today's gospel reading. Well, it's because I went back and read chapter 16. What's this called? Context. So we find out that in chapter 16, Peter has confessed Jesus as the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Jesus praises Peter. He says to him, Peter, you are the rock. And on this rock I will build my church. And you can imagine, how do you suppose Peter felt? Pretty good. Awesome, Emma says. Wow, hey, I got it right. So Peter's feeling pretty good. But then Jesus starts to teach them and talk to them about the fact that, hey, we're on our way to Jerusalem. And in Jerusalem, of course this is what happens after they go up on the mountain. In Jerusalem, he's going to suffer, he tells them. In fact, he tells them he's going to undergo great suffering, and he's going to be killed. Of course, he also tells them that he'll be raised from the dead, but it's as if that doesn't even register. And Peter is so offended that he actually chastises Jesus. And they want to do what all of us want to do when we're facing that which we would rather avoid. They want a second opinion. They want an alternative choice. They want to stop time. They don't want to move ahead to face that which is difficult. And so you can imagine that when suddenly Jesus is transfigured and he's shining with the bright light of God, and their heroes in the faith, Moses and Elijah, show up, oh, Peter must have thought, oh, we can't leave here. The text says, he says, how good, Lord, to be here. Well, wouldn't you have said that? I mean, you're feeling pretty bad about yourself. Jesus says suffering's on the horizon. Of course, you're going to say, can't we stay? Any one of us would have said that. I mean, Peter wants to keep the suffering at bay, right? Peter wants to build a sanctuary that will keep them all safe and secure, that'll keep the difficulty down there in Jerusalem. So Peter says, how good, Lord, to be here. Can't we just stay here? Can't we stop time? Okay, you're facing that difficult thing. You know you're going to have to make a difficult choice, and there's no good answer. You know you're going to have to go in for a surgery that you don't want to have. You know that you have to have this emotional encounter with someone, and the outcome's likely not to be good. What do you want to do? And if it's good in the moment, you just want to stop time. That's what's happening with Peter. But it's not to be. It's not to be. The very voice of God says to them, this is my son, the beloved one. And by the way, listen to him. Which is sort of the same as saying, follow him. Do what he tells you to do. So they have to come down off the mountain and walk on the path of suffering. They can't stop time. And neither can we. But there's an important message here. And the message is this. It's true. We are powerless over suffering to a large degree. Now, some of our choices cause suffering. We're not necessarily powerless over those. But there's a lot in life over which we are powerless. So we are powerless over suffering. But at the same time, as was true for Peter, James, and John, we are powerless over the light of God shining in our darkness. Let me say that again. We cannot shield ourselves. We can't keep it from happening. This is in a positive sense. We can't keep the light of God from shining into the darkest moment. Now, I'm not saying we necessarily recognize it's there, but we can't keep it from happening any more than Peter, James, and John could keep Jesus from being transfigured and the light of God shining on them. Let me share with you what one of the commentators named Marietta Anschutz has to say about that. We glimpse that moment in a hospital room as we wait with two people who have just heard the worst news of their lives and watch the patient reach out to assure the companion, the healthy one, that all will be well. We glimpse that moment when the evening news reflects nothing but chaos, and then there is one story of a person's graceful act of healing a broken world by caring for another person the world would rather forget. These are moments when people begin to understand that where there is suffering, there is holy ground. These are the moments when we realize that God is present in suffering and sacrifice, just as God is present in the promise and potential of our lives. So, Peter, James, and John could not shield themselves from the light shining in their darkest moment. And either can we. For Peter, James, and John, the transfiguration was an event to remember, but it also was a recurring reality. And the same is true for us, because you see, the light of God shines on our suffering. And that suffering then transforms the ground below us into that which is holy. Now, as I said, we may not recognize that, but it doesn't mean that the light isn't shining or that we aren't standing on holy ground. Because God is with us, therefore, it's hope. Now, we often think of Lent or Ash Wednesday as a dark time, I think. I was reminded of that this week when I was reading this story in the Christian Century about a woman named Vera and her sister Audrey. Without going into too much detail, I'll just say that Audrey was struggling in life, and she made the decision, sadly, to end her life on Ash Wednesday. So for Vera, Ash Wednesday was an overwhelmingly dark day. And she writes that that was a year when Easter was early. Easter was, in March. Maybe it was snowing on Easter. Who knows? I don't know where she lived. But Easter just seemed too early. It just seemed to her as if Lent went by just like that. And the celebration of the resurrection was, for her, almost like an offense. Because she felt like we should be living in Lent. Life is Lent. That's how she felt. She couldn't sense the light of God shining in her suffering. Doesn't mean it wasn't happening, but she couldn't feel it. And then she learned something that caused the light to become known to her. Now, when I tell you this, you might think, well, that doesn't seem like it's that big of a deal. But to her it was. Because she learned that before her sister died in hospital, the hospital chaplain had come and had traced a cross of ashes on her sister Audrey's forehead. Now remember, the cross of ashes has two meanings. The ashes remind us of the impermanence of life. Remember that you are dust, but to dust you shall return. The cross, though, has a whole different message. The cross reminds us of forgiveness, that we are forgiven and that new life awaits us. So when Vera learned that her sister was marked with the Christ before her death, she felt the light. And she said that from now on, from that point on, Ash Wednesday, it still is, it's like a homecoming for her whenever Ash Wednesday rolls around. Because she says it's the most honest of days. It's the day when at the same time you sit in the darkness, but also feel the light. Well, Wednesday is Ash Wednesday. And we who gather here will receive the cross of ashes, which is at the same time darkness and light. A sign of the light shining in our suffering. Like Peter, James, and John, we are powerless over much that happens in our lives, and much of it involves suffering. But like Peter, James, and John, we cannot shield ourselves. We cannot prevent, maybe is a better way to say it, the light of God from shining in our darkest moments. Even if we don't realize it. Isn't that astounding? It's there. And it's making the ground on which we are standing whole.